60 feet beneath the surface of a flooded chamber in southeastern Missouri, in water so cold and so clear that a diver's lamp throws its beam far out before the dark closes over it. There is a wall of cut stone with an opening set into the middle of it. The opening is squared. The blocks around it are dressed and fitted, laid by someone who understood load and pressure, and the way rock begins to move once the ore has been taken out from beneath it. A timber frame once braced the top. In the still, airless water, the wood has not so much rotted as turned to something like dark leather, swollen and holding its shape after all this time. Beyond the opening, a passage runs back into a blackness no lamp has any real business trying to fill. What you are looking at, if you ever go down there, is a doorway. Somebody built it. And for the oldest of these openings, cut into the lowest and earliest workings of a mine that ran for very nearly 100 years, there is no surviving document that names the men who set the stone, or gives the day they set it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The chamber is the flooded lower level of the Bonne Terre mine, in the town that carries the same name, in the old lead country of southeastern Missouri. For most of a century, the mine belonged to the St. Joseph Lead Company, which sank its first shafts there in the 1860s and went on cutting downward and outward for decade after decade, until the workings ran for miles on level after level, one gallery stacked beneath the next, held dry the entire time by pumps that never stopped. In 1962, the company shut the pumps off. The last shift came up, the machinery went quiet, and the groundwater the pumps had held back for generations began to climb. It rose through the lowest galleries first, then the next, filling the cut stone and the timber and the abandoned iron the way water fills any room left open to it, patiently and without any regard for what it covered. When it finished, the bottom of the mine was a lake. Men had spent 100 years keeping the water out. It took the water only a few years to take all of it back. What the water preserved is the reason anyone goes down there now. Cold, still, and nearly without oxygen, the flooded galleries did to the mine what dry air never would have done. The ore carts still sit on their rails. The rails still run true along the drift floors, iron laid straight by men who measured it. A locomotive sits where it was left. Wooden staircases climb from one submerged level toward another and hold their treads. Drills, scaffolding, the ordinary furniture of a working mine, all of it stands in the dark exactly where the last man to touch it set it down, going on 60 years ago, wrapped now in water instead of air. Divers move through it slowly, in the narrow reach of their lamps, and what they pass is not a ruin the way a surface ruin is a ruin. Nothing has fallen, nothing has been scattered. Everything is simply where it was, sealed, waiting, held. Among the things they pass are the walls. Not the raw rock of the drifts, blasted and hacked into whatever shape the ore required, but built walls, dressed stone laid in courses, bulkheads set square across passages, and here and there an opening framed in fitted rock and braced timber, like the one 60 feet down. Some of these are easy enough to account for. A mine that ran 100 years, walled off, worked out ground constantly, sealed flooded sections, framed doorways between one part of the operation and another, and left a paper record of a great deal of what it did, but not all of it. The St. Joseph Lead Company was not the first operation to cut into that ground, and the ground it inherited had been worked, in one form or another, for a very long time before any shaft at Bonne Terre was ever sunk. The lead country of Missouri is one of the oldest worked mineral districts on the continent. French colonial miners were taking galena out of the ground there in the 1720s, after a man named Philippe Francois Renaud brought crews and equipment up from the lower Mississippi to dig for silver and settled for lead when the silver did not come. The workings they opened, Mine La Motte among the oldest of them, were shallow by later standards, pitted and trenched into the near surface with hand tools. But they were worked hard, and worked for years, and when they were abandoned they were not filled in, they were simply left. Three-quarters of a century after that, in 1798, an American named Moses Austin arrived in the district, took a Spanish land grant, and built the first real industry the region had seen, a reverberatory furnace, organized workings, and a settlement that grew into a town. The whole apparatus of serious mining set down on ground the French had already been turning over for 2 generations. Austin's men reopened old diggings and followed old trenches down, and by his day the district was already a place where a crew could break into ground it believed to be untouched, and find instead that someone had been there first. Older stone, older timber, tool marks left by hands the record had not kept. The record that survives from the Bonne Terre operation itself is, for its later decades, very good. The St. Joseph Lead Company was a serious industrial concern, and by the 20th century it documented its workings the way any large mining company documents them, in survey maps, level plans, production ledgers, and engineering drawings that show which galleries were cut when. For those decades, a wall underwater can usually be matched to a page. The map says a bulkhead was set in a given year to seal a worked-out stope, and the bulkhead is there, and the question answers itself. The trouble is not the 20th century. The trouble is everything underneath it. A mine is not built once. It is built continuously, downward, for as long as the ore holds out, and every level that goes in passes through and reopens and builds over the workings that came before. By the time the St. Joseph Lead Company sank its shafts in the 1860s, the ground it was sinking them into had already been mined, in one fashion or another, for something close to 150 years. The French had been there, Austin's operation had been there, smaller outfits whose names survive only as entries in old land records had been there, taking what they could reach and moving on. Each of them left workings, almost none of them left plans. And the deep company that came last cut down through all of it, following the ore into ground that older men had already opened, sealing and framing and walling as it went, in among stone and timber that was already old when its own first shift walked in. What that means, 60 feet down, is that not every wall has a page. Some of the built stone in the lowest and oldest reaches of the flooded workings belongs to no surviving plan at all. It sits below the levels the good maps cover, in ground the company inherited rather than opened, and the record runs out before it reaches that deep. There is no ledger entry for it. There is no engineering drawing that shows it. There is no name attached to the hands that dressed the blocks and set the frame and cut the opening a diver's lamp now finds in the dark. Not because the name was hidden, because the name was never written down, or was written down on paper that a failing company, a merger, a fire, or simply 160 years of indifference did not trouble to keep. This is the part of the story that gets flattened in the retelling, and it is the part worth slowing down on. When someone says there is no record of who built the door, the sentence carries a suggestion it has not earned, that the absence is deliberate, that a record once existed and was taken away. The truth is at once more ordinary, and in its own way harder to sit with. The lead district of Missouri was worked by so many hands, for so long, under so many operators, most of whom kept little and preserved less, that the ground itself outlasted its own documentation. The workings are older than the paperwork. What is missing was never suppressed. It was simply never kept, by people who had no reason to imagine that anyone, 160 years on, would be 60 feet underwater in the dark, shining a light on their stonework, and asking who they had been. There is a second reason the record thins as you go down, and it has nothing to do with age. The flooded part of the mine has never been fully mapped. The upper works, the parts a visitor can walk, are known. The parts a diver can reach on a guided line are known. But the water fills level after level below that, and the passages run back farther than any lamp has followed, into flooded ground where no survey has ever been made, because no survey has ever been possible. What lies at the bottom of the Bonne Terre workings is not only a matter of a lost page, it is a matter of a place no living person has ever seen. The company's deepest levels went where the ore went, and the ore went deep, and when the pumps stopped, the water took all of it, the mapped and the unmapped alike, and closed over the difference. Somewhere down there, below the reach of the guided lines and below the last level any surviving plan describes, there is built stone that no human eye has looked at since the water rose over it in the early 1960s. Some of it may be company work, some of it may be older. There is, at present, no way to tell, and no one has yet gone deep enough to try. So the doorway 60 feet down stays what it is. A squared opening in a dressed stone wall, framed in timber gone to leather, opening onto a passage that runs back into water no one has surveyed, in the lowest reach of a mine that inherited its own oldest ground from operators who kept no plans, in a district that has been cut into for 300 years by the French, by Austin's men, by a dozen forgotten outfits, and finally by the company that drowned it. The stone was cut by someone. The record does not say who, and in the oldest cases the record never did. That is the honest shape of it. And Bonne Terre, it turns out, is not the only flooded mine in that country where the water is holding something the paperwork can no longer name. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. To understand how completely a district can lose the authorship of its own work, it helps to stop treating Bonne Terre as a single mine and start seeing it as one room in a much larger house that is now entirely underwater. The workings there were never sealed off from the country around them. They were part of a field, the old lead belt of southeastern Missouri, a band of ground perhaps 10 miles long and a few miles wide, where the same companies, chasing the same ore body, sank shaft after shaft through the last decades of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. Flat River, Deloge, Leadwood, Elvins, river mines, towns that grew up on top of the shafts and took their livelihoods from them, connected below ground by drifts and hologways until much of the belt was a single continuous excavation, a hollowed underlayer running from one town to the next. And when the ore finally gave out and the last operations wound down, the pumps that had kept the whole system dry were shut off together, across the field, in the same handful of years. The water did to the old lead belt what it had done to Bonne Terre. It came up everywhere at once. The field was let go all at once because the ore that had built it finally ran out at roughly the same time, and because the industry that had lived on it did not vanish so much as move. West of the old lead belt, in the 1960s, mining companies opened a newer and richer band of ore, the trend that would come to be called the new lead belt, and the money and the men and the machinery followed it there. The old field was not defeated. It was abandoned in favor of a better one, which is a colder kind of ending, and it meant that when the pumps went off in the exhausted east, there was no longer anyone with a reason to keep the workings dry or the records current. The mines were left because they were finished, and the finishing was thorough, and the water was simply what came in behind a departure no one intended to reverse. What the water rose over, from one end of the field to the other, was built the same way, because it was built by the same industry, in the same decades to the same purpose. The bulkheads that seal worked-out ground in one town are the bulkheads that seal it in the next. The dressed stone walls, the fitted openings, the timber framing set into rock, all of it repeats across the belt with the sameness of a trade that taught its men to do a thing one way and then had them do it 10,000 times. A person who learned to read the construction in one flooded mine could read it in another, because there is nothing to read but the same competent, anonymous work, done well, done everywhere, and signed nowhere. That is the first half of the pattern, and on its own it is not strange. An industry builds the way it builds. The strangeness is in the second half, and the second half is about the record, because the second thing that repeats across the field, as reliably as the stonework, is the absence of a name to put to the oldest of it. The old lead belt was not opened all at once by one company that kept one archive. It was opened in pieces, over generations, by a shifting roster of operators who bought and sold, and merged and failed, and each transfer of ground was a chance for the paper to be lost. A small outfit sank a shaft in the 1870s, worked it, went under, and sold the whole to a larger one, which extended it and in time was itself swallowed by a larger one still. Somewhere in that chain, the survey of the original shaft stopped being anyone's responsibility to keep. The workings passed forward. The plans did not. By the time the whole belt consolidated under a few big names in the 20th century, a great deal of the ground those names now owned had been cut by hands, 2 or 3 owners back, and the documentation of that early cutting had thinned to nothing along the way. The pattern is not that someone hid the records. The pattern is that an industry built out of small failures and larger absorptions has no single memory, and the parts of it that no surviving company ever troubled to inherit on paper are simply gone from the account, even as the stone they left stands in the water, intact, waiting to be attributed to no one. There is a way to see the visible half of all this without ever getting into the water. The old lead belt left its waste on the surface in mountains, the crushed rock called chat, piled into flat-topped grey hills that still stand over the towns of the field, so large that for decades local children sledded down them and the wind carried their dust for miles. Those piles are the part of the operation that could not be drowned. Every one of them is the above-ground shadow of a hole, the tailings of ore that came up out of ground that is now underwater, and standing among them a person is standing on the one remaining measure of how much rock was moved and how many years of labor it took to move it. What the chat piles do not record is who. They are the sum of the work with the worker's identity ground out of it. Tons of anonymous evidence that something enormous happened here and left almost no one's name behind. The paper that does survive survives in fragments, and the fragments are scattered across exactly the kinds of places records end up when the concern that made them no longer exists. Some of the old lead belts plans and machinery were kept, and can still be seen, at the state historic site that preserves one of the great mills at the northern edge of the field, where the surface apparatus of the industry was gathered and held rather than scrapped. Some of it sits in county courthouses, in the deed books and land grants that recorded who owned the ground, even when no one recorded who dug it. Some of it, the oldest layer, reaches back into French and Spanish colonial records kept an ocean away, from the era when this district was a distant possession worked for a crown that had hoped for silver. And a great deal of it is simply gone, burned or pulped, or thrown out in the long indifferent stretch between the closing of a mine and the moment anyone thought its history worth saving. The surviving record is real, and it is useful, and it is nowhere near enough to name the builder of every wall the water is holding. Set the two halves of the pattern together, the identical anonymous stonework, and the record that thins to nothing beneath its most recent layer, and the implication is not exotic. It does not require a lost people or a forgotten race, or any builder more mysterious than a mine worker whose century happened to come before the habit of keeping things. What it requires is harder in a quieter way. It requires accepting that ordinary history, industrial and colonial and close enough to touch, is fully capable of erasing its own authorship, that the men who cut the oldest openings in the Missouri lead were as real and as skilled as the men who cut the newest, and that the only difference between the two is that the world happened to write down the second group and happened not to write down the first. The stone is proof of the workers, it is not proof of their names, because their names were never the thing anyone thought to preserve. The evidence of the hand is total, and the evidence of the identity is zero, and both of those facts are sitting in the same cold water, at the same depth, in the same dark. Which leaves one place where the fullest record of the old lead belt now lives, and it is not a courthouse or a museum or a colonial ledger. It is the water. The flooded workings are the most complete archive of the district that exists, a physical record of every wall, every opening, every fitted stone, held in a preservative so effective that the timber has not rotted in 60 years, and the iron sits unrusted on rails that still run true. Everything the paper failed to keep, the water kept, in full, in place, in the exact configuration in which it was left. The catch is that this archive cannot be read the way an archive is read. Most of it has never been seen. The mapped and lighted portions, the guided routes a diver can follow, are a small bright margin at the top of a darkness that runs down through level, after flooded level, into ground no survey has ever reached. The record is complete and almost entirely closed. It is all down there, every anonymous wall of it, and the water that saved it is the same water that keeps it beyond the reach of anyone who might finally ask it who built what and when. There is a hard finality in that, harder than the finality of a document that was lost, because a lost document might always turn up. A flooded lower level hundreds of feet down in freezing water does not turn up. It stays exactly where it is, and the stone in it stays anonymous, not for want of a surviving page, but for want of anyone able to go and stand in front of it, and even begin the work of dating it. The oldest openings in the Missouri lead were cut by people whose identities failed to survive on the surface, and whose work will now almost certainly outlast every attempt to recover those identities from below. The two erasures reinforce each other. What the paper let go, the water made unreachable. And so the question of who built the deepest and earliest of it is not open the way an unsolved case is open. It is closed by physics, sealed under more water than any argument can drain. Go back, at the end, to the single squared opening the whole story began with, the dressed stone and the leathered timber 60 feet down, and see it now for what the rest of the field makes plain it is. It is not an anomaly, it is a specimen. One example, reachable where most are not, of a kind of thing that repeats through the drowned belt, from end to end, and it carries the entire pattern in miniature, the flawless evidence of skilled human work, and the total absence of the worker's name, sealed together in water that has kept the first and will never surrender the second. Someone stood in that spot with tools and knowledge and a reason, and squared those blocks, and set that frame, and cut that passage into the rock, and then walked home to a town that is now either gone or renamed, in a century that did not think to write down what he had done or who he was. The work is real, it is still there. A person willing to descend into the cold and the dark can put a hand on the proof of him. The only thing that did not survive is the one thing a record is for, and the water is now the sole keeper of everything the paper let slip, holding the stone in perfect condition and the man who cut it in perfect anonymity, 60 feet down, in the dark, waiting for a question the water will not let anyone finish asking. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.